Low IQ recruits sent into the meat grinder. Physical strength, intelligence, and courage might be some of the values generally demanded in the ideal soldier. But in times of war, a desperate country may find that relaxing these conditions is necessary in order to swell its ranks with more troops. Put simply, the daydreamers who normally sat at the back of the class now became viable options for military service, to be followed by a few years of brutal combat operations overseas. The authorities would find it more convenient looking the other way when someone failed an English paper if they can now be shipped off to fight on the front line in Vietnam. And in the 1960s, this is exactly what happened when U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara implemented a plan to greatly increase American troop numbers in Vietnam through his Project 100,000, which was more cruelly referred to as McNamara's Morons by its critics. The Vietnam War was, at its foundation, a proxy war between the Communist Soviet Union and the United States. Second in a series of conflicts that would become known as the Indochina Wars, the Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975 and was a result of North Vietnamese efforts to overpower the South Vietnamese. Backed by both the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam's President Ho Chi Minh sought to unify the entire country under a communist regime. However, President Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, wanted to model his country after Western ideals and firmly rejected the North's agenda, openly welcoming military aid from the United States. During the war, Robert McNamara worked as the U.S. Secretary of Defense, serving under both Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson from 1961 to 1968. While in office, he held a massive influence over the expansion of America's role in Vietnam and pushed for continuous involvement in the conflict for a number of years. His willingness to spend enormous amounts of money on troops and resources was spurred on by his realization that if the North Vietnamese were to gain unquestioned control over the entire country, then the larger geographical region would face massive destabilization from communism. This often led to a heavy-handed approach when seated at the political table. In one notable case, he played a critical role in expanding America's involvement in the war, convincing President Kennedy to increase the number of American troops stationed in Vietnam as advisors from 900 to over 16,000. The threat from the North kept him occupied for the duration of the war, forever worrying about the destabilization of Southeast Asia if communism should prevail over Western ideals.
Forget Vietnam, everyone knows World War II is where the best battles were. At Simple History, we love when you can dive straight into authentic gameplay, like with Enlisted. Introducing the best in free-to-play, multiplayer World War II gaming. Crush the enemy in your tank, or shoot them out of the sky while cruising above the clouds in your Junkers plane. Or become the lowly foot soldier and maneuver into position before taking down the enemy in a hail of gunfire. Across World War II's most iconic battlefields, there's no way you'll be used as cannon fodder in this strategic war game, as you customize your soldier skills and inventory to create the ultimate battle squad. Consider your position, build your defenses, collaborate with your teammates, and get ready to fight. With cross-platform integration, Enlisted offers you the chance to fight alongside your friends, be it on Xbox, PlayStation, or PC. Armed with historically accurate weaponry and equipment, you'll feel like you're really there, fighting alongside Simple History. With no purchase necessary, download the game using the link in the description below, and you'll receive the exclusive bonus of 3 days premium content and several orders for weapons and troops to upgrade your own squad. Help support the channel. Join us for a game. We'll see you in the skies above Normandy soon.
Despite increasing conscription, by 1966, McNamara and the United States were struggling with their efforts in the country, and the picture was becoming increasingly bleak. After suffering a massive number of casualties, the U.S. realized that the North Vietnamese really were a force to be reckoned with. In 1965, Robert McNamara visited the country himself and was reported to have been horrified at his findings, telling President Johnson that by early 1966 they'd have to send at least an additional 100,000 troops to have any hope of securing a South Vietnamese victory. Realizing that the U.S. was facing a potential crisis, McNamara formed an idea that he believed would simultaneously help end the war in Vietnam as well as provide training and opportunity to the uneducated and the poor. In October 1966, he launched Project 100,000, which focused on conscripting those men that had previously been rejected from the draft by lowering the requirements for entry. After World War II, the requirement was to have an IQ of 80 or higher to be able to enlist in the Army. But McNamara now understood that lowering many standards, such as the minimum score on the Armed Forces qualification test and the requirement of a high school diploma, was necessary to provide the additional manpower he needed. The required score for the test was dramatically reduced by 6%, and soldiers no longer needed to have passed high school exams. This meant that those who had not made the grade before suddenly found themselves eligible, although not necessarily fit for the position. The goal was to get 40,000 of these men enlisted in the first year, and then 100,000 each year thereafter. McNamara called them his New Standards Men, but to everyone else they were known by the cruel nickname, McNamara's Morons. His reforms now included men who had physical impairments or limited mental capacity, and those who were from low socioeconomic areas who had never had a real chance at furthering their education. The majority were also just 20 years old, barely into adulthood, and naive enough to believe McNamara's promises. When McNamara first announced Project 100,000, he hadn't even mentioned the possibility of active combat. Instead, it was presented as a chance for the downtrodden to improve their education and socioeconomic status, with the promise of a bright future following the completion of their military service. Once in military training, these men were given the exact same expectations and requirements as any other soldier. 3 traits were then created for men from Project 100,000. Number 1, for slow learners. Number 2, for those with mental or emotional health problems, as well as those who simply lacked motivation. And number 3, for those who were either under or overweight and needed a fitness routine. Once these issues had been identified, they would then enter into the standard basic training program for the U.S. Army, and from there they'd be assigned to a branch of the military. By March 1969, there were roughly 190,000 of McNamara's New Standards men ready to be funneled into the armed forces. It should come as no surprise that 71% of these men were taken by the Army, which made up the bulk of the fighting force in Vietnam. These men were previously rejected or deemed unfit for duty prior to McNamara's decision to lower the requirements. In other words, they were not the cream of the crop coming in to turn the tides of war. Many were simply unable to do more than what was required for basic military combat, but still found themselves shipped off to Vietnam as part of the Army. McNamara and by association President Johnson were targeting the most vulnerable and poorest sections of society in order to protect the middle classes from being called up for active duty. The government called the program a success at the time, but the truth is far more disturbing. Overall, soldiers from Project 100,000 were 3 times more likely to die in combat, and those who did survive suffered severely during and after the war. Throughout its implementation, the program was seen as controversial. Today, it's recognized as a desperate measure at best and a horrifying exploitation by the U.S. government at its worst. McNamara shamelessly promised these people a bright future. He filled them with dreams of better lives, decent jobs, and housing that they could be proud of. Their military service record was supposed to be something they could be equally proud of. The reality was quite the opposite. As well as sustaining increased casualties, soldiers from McNamara's Project 100,000 were treated unfairly during their days in Vietnam and were more likely to receive a discharge under conditions other than honorable once their service was over. Things that other regular soldiers would have been reprimanded for, like getting drunk, answering back, or neglecting to carry out an order, became grounds for harsh punishment for McNamara's 100,000. These punishments stayed with the soldiers and impacted their entire service record. By the project's end in 1971, around 180,000 soldiers were discharged from the Army as a result of these measures. Unfortunately, the harsh treatment didn't end there. After the Vietnam War ended, many veterans were abused by an angry, disenfranchised American public whose perception of the war had turned unfavorable towards the government, and those returning from the front line found they could only get the benefits they were promised if they had been honorably discharged from the military. Therefore, many men from Project 100,000 did not qualify. Worse still, many of them found that they were now worse off than before the war, with 20,270 veterans suffering from a combat-sustained injury, and a further 500 left with amputations from their wounds. None of this, however, even begins to account for the psychological trauma they suffered from a result of the atrocities they had witnessed in Vietnam. Following the conclusion of Vietnam, McNamara's popularity declined. Despite his best efforts to highlight the successes of his project, the public remained critical of his actions. And although he would publicly admit to his failures in the decades that followed, he never issued a formal apology. He continually left one group out from his explanations and excuses in regards to his conduct during the war: his Project 100,000 New Standards men.
By signing up for Enlisted via Simple History, you're not only playing a super fun game, you're supporting us and helping us continue to make great historical content for you. Plus, using the link in the description below, you'll get 3 days of premium time, plus orders of troops and weapons. So why wouldn't you want to fight alongside us? Join Simple History on Enlisted today.